Sandra Betzina shares her knowledge with you from her work as a nationally syndicated sewing columnist and a regular contributor to Threads and other fiber-related magazines. She's a frequent guest on television and lectures nationally. And as an instructor at the Sewing Workshop in San Francisco, Sandra is up to date on the needs of the sewer and problem-solving techniques used by master sewers and designers.
A hand-woven or quilted garment may be the most beautiful piece of clothing you own. Show it off best with a non-competing background so it just stands on its own. A jacket is enough, or a dress is enough. And you don't have to limit yourself to cut-on sleeves or collarless styles. A lot's possible with this fabric. But if you are unsure about a pattern, what I would do, I'd pre-test it like in an old bedspread. You can get one at the thrift store, and that'll have the approximate drape of a hand-woven fabric. If it's a quilted fabric, pre-test it in something a little stiffer like felt, so you can get the feeling about what the garment will do in the end. This fabric was woven by Tim Van Ness, and it's an unlined jacket. It's actually an unlined coat, mid-calf length. It has no interfacing in it at all. It just has a suede, kind of a loopy suede collar, and it has suede trim around, and this type of pocket. It's a real easy pocket that I'll show you how to make. And so it's just, now this jacket is very important that it has shoulder pads, but it just, you go along with the drape of the fabric that's already there. This fabric was woven by Twill & Tuck in Spokane, and it was actually made as well by Linda Curtis. It's a beautiful jacket. It's lined, but there is no interfacing in the entire front, only interfacing on the facing. Now this works well unless you have that little hollow in between the shoulder and the armhole, and then it caves in there. But it's beautifully made. It's lined with Bemberg rayon. This handwoven, as you can see, has lots of copper metallic threads. It's unlined, but it's fused. If you could open it up, you'll see it's fused in the inside with a fusible tricot front and back. It was just to stabilize the threads. It also has a leather upper collar. It was just very easy. And then in the back, you'll see the little crisscross of the belt. This was an old Vogue pattern, but I stabilized both the front and back with fusible interfacing. This fabric was woven by Twill & Tuck in Spokane. I've bought it from them. The entire front is interfaced with a fusible tricot. And the facing on the inside, instead of putting a facing, I often do this, I will take and cut a whole second front, and I cut a second front out of linen, and then I put some fusible tricot just in the shape of the facing on this. In the back of the coat now, in the sleeves, there is no fusible interfacing, so it has a nice drape to it. This is another one of the Tim Van Ness fabrics. It's a linen and cotton blend, and I use the lengthwise grain of the fabrics to go in the main part of the jacket, and then as it goes around on the bottom, you can see the crosswise of the fabric. This entire jacket, it was fused with a fusible knitted interfacing, and so I took every piece, cut it out, and then fused interfacing to it. And just with big buttons, I have the buttonhole right in the seam. Now this trapeze-shaped jacket, the fabric was woven by, it was actually woven by Twill & Tuck, and Linda Curtis, who's the weaver, also made the jacket. It's totally unlined. It's a wool, mohair, cotton, and silk, and the mohair sometimes is itchy for some people, so this jacket is totally unlined. It's got a beautiful pocket and contrasting cuff detailing on this. It's just like a nice big sweater, and it's very comfortable. This is another one of Tim Van Ness's fabric that has cotton and rayon in it. Now what we have on the front of this jacket, I fused fusible knitted interfacing on the whole front and the facing as well, but then the back, when you turn around to the back, you'll see, and it's lined inside, and then the back has no interfacing, so that it has that big deep pleat, so it has drapeability to it. So this is a situation, and the sleeves are not interfaced at all. They just have lining in them. So the front and the facing is fused, and then since it's a large button, you can see that I used a loop instead of a buttonhole, and I used part of the lighter stripe against the face because that's usually more flattering against the face. Now this unlined jacket was made by the Mendocino Weavers. It's 100% cotton. It's nice and soft, And it's totally unlined. The only fusible interfacing is that which is used in the facing. And also I did a little work behind the grommets. I stabilized it a little bit. But see, once again, that's just the sweater look. So if you want it to be soft, then that's what you have to, you unline it and you don't do anything else to it. Now this is a Chanel type jacket, and that means that on the inside the lining comes all the way to the edge, and it's weighted at the hem. But this fabric is by Twill and Tuck. It's a weaver in Spokane, Washington. She does sell her beautiful fabrics. And this is the wool trim. Now, how was this treated? Because this is kind of a loopy, loose weave, I took the entire fabric, and every piece on this jacket has been interfaced with fusible knit tricot. So all the way around, and then it's lined in China silk. This oversized shirt doesn't have any interfacing in it under the placket, and it's totally unlined. It's a very stable hand woven, but it's lightweight. This is a wonderful shirt, beautiful button choice. This was Twill and Tuck, and Linda Curtis made this one also. The other ones I made, but she made some beautiful ones. And she took the sleeve and did the stripe going the opposite direction on the sleeve, and the same with on the collar. Now this is a blouson jacket, and it has kind of a loose top. I took and interfaced all the pieces in the jacket with a fusible tricot, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember who the weaver is, and it's such beautiful fabric, but you can see a lot of metallic threads, deep pleats in the back, and absolutely shoulder pads are a must. But the main thing is this was fused entirely because those metallic threads tend to break and they catch on things, so that's why I used interfacing behind the whole jacket. I call this dress my carpool dress because it was something that always looked great. You didn't need any accessories. It didn't wrinkle, never looked like it got dirty. It was wonderful. And what is so wonderful about it is the fabric itself. It was a hand woven by Bianculli that I bought, and this is a raglan sleeve here. And so I lined the dress from here down just a little bit below the seat in Bemberg rayon, and I used that so that it would be hand washable. I do hand wash this, and then I lay it down flat. I don't put things in the dryer, although I know other weavers that do. When I tailor coats, I definitely send those to the cleaners, but something like this can actually be hand washed. The one thing I guess I would have to say, the metallic threads, this has been worn so much, they have a tendency to fray. But it's just a nice piece. Now, on a plaid, usually you'd have a tendency to avoid a plaid because hand weavers have a hard time reproducing the same plaid. But as you can see here, this is not matched, and it really didn't matter. Now this is it's like a little sweater. There's no interfacing. This is another one of Tim Van Ness's piece. I used to be able to buy some of his leftover pieces. This is unlined. There's only interfacing underneath of the facing along the front. Other than that, there's nothing else in there. It's just like a little loose sweater. And we put a little bit of interfacing behind the grommets, but that's it. See, you see how much looser it hangs when you don't put the interfacing in it. So you have to decide if you want the look of a sweater or if you want the look of a real tailored jacket. I'd like for you to meet Warren Whaley, and he is the designer for Quilt Crazy in Rohnert Park. He does beautiful quilted things, and I just thought it might be interesting for you to see what he does, and he sells these, so I think it would be interesting to see what really sells, what women are looking for. Hello, Warren.
Hi.
You know, whenever I see you, I always think you do things with quilted things that I don't see a lot of quilters do, and you have a great color sense. I mean, have you always had this?
I think so. I started out doing quilts, traditional quilts, but I think what sold my quilts was my sense of color, you know.
Right.
It's more than doing just putting colors together. You have to know what belongs together or works together.
Because this is beautiful. Now, did you start out making garments that were totally quilted all over, or did you always put it together with something?
I most always have put it together with something. Those garments that are all quilted they look bulky and, well, I don't know, they just don't appeal to me, and I don't think they sell well. Of course, I'm into selling.
Okay,
so.
right, okay. So tell me, are there certain things that sell better than others?
Yes, I think those things that sell best are things that have good color sense and have some style to them and are not
Just
bulky.
boxy, not
Right.
okay. That's one of the things I've noticed when I was looking at your clothes. Your clothes are not bulky. What kind of batting do you use? Because so many, you know, there are all different types of batting. But do you have a batting you use, or do you not use any?
Most of the things I do in garments, I use sort of a medium weight batting, probably 3 ounce to sometimes 5 ounce batting, because all of these things are machine pieced and quilted, and the batting tends to flatten out some by when you're doing it by machine.
Now, would you only put the batting behind the quilted sections, or would you put it behind the whole thing? Like I was just, see, what I like about this is that it is not bulky.
Well, now this particular one has no batting
Has
at
none.
all.
Okay, so
this is just the
so you don't
patchwork.
always have to have batting.
Don't always have to have batting.
Because I think most women in particular are not trying to add any more weight to it. So you did the quilting, but you didn't put the batting in.
Right.
Because it's very effective. It's really nice. Now, would this be something that you would hand wash? Would you send it to the cleaners? Would you throw it in the washing machine?
All my fabrics have been pre-shrunk and everything, so I can throw this right into the washer.
That's
you know.
wonderful.
All of my garments are that way.
How long would it take, labor-wise, to make something like this, though?
Well, this one takes a little time because of the seminal patchwork that's involved here. Although it's a fast patchwork, but to create a design and to figure out just where it goes and like that takes a little time to do. But it's not difficult.
Right. Now, do you have do you find certain colors sell better than others?
Yes, I find that the plums and lavenders, maroons, those colors seem to sell better.
I think it's because they cast a little light onto your face.
Right, and they're a little more flattering to most people.
Right.
I would never make a jacket out of yellow, for instance. It just probably
Wouldn't sell.
wouldn't
All right.
move.
And what about the shapes? I mean, well, I was thinking about sizing, actually. Do you try to make a one-size-fits-all?
Occasionally, but not always. It's one of those things that if a jacket is going to be the least bit bulky, I'm sure that some larger person is not going to be interested in it. So
right.
You kind of have to gauge your design and everything to the size of the person. I think most of the things that I do, I try to train the patchwork, to follow the patchwork to make it look more slenderizing.
Okay, perfect. Let's see, I see a shirt right there that you've done. It's a beautiful. All right, now this is the one that has, all right, this has some batting in it. And so this is that, is it 3 ounce, you said?
No, in this particular one, I used polyester fleece.
All right.
That's quite a lightweight. I think if
nice.
I do this shirt again or something on this order, I may try using a 3 ounce batting and separating it, pulling it apart so I have even a lighter weight in here. I like this feel, but it's a little bit dense. I would rather have it a little lighter.
A little bit
weight.
lighter. Okay. Now, tell me, did you include? You brought the batting out? Did that go all the way into the sleeve seam?
Yes.
Or do you, okay. All right. Because
did,
it looks really nice. Tell me, this is a nice pattern. Do you make your own patterns, or do you use commercial patterns?
Well, I experiment with commercial patterns. Occasionally, I make my own pattern, but the way I've worked for a number of years is to take a commercial pattern and then change it the way I want it.
Right.
Like this shirt, this is a pattern that I've done, I don't know how many times, probably several dozen times. But there's no two of them alike. I changed the yoke, I changed, where the patchwork is.
Now tell me, I mean, your top stitching looks beautiful. How do you get it so that it goes along here and doesn't create little folds and bumps? And I mean, do you use an even feed foot, dual feed, or how do you?
My machine has even feed or dual feed.
Dual feed, okay.
And to do my top stitching on something like this, I use the blind hem foot because it has a little guide on there, and you can set it along the edge here and just zoom right
that's
along.
why it's so perfect.
So it goes along nice.
This looks great. What kind of interfacing did you use in the band and the neck? What's your
all
favorite?
of my shirts I use shirt tailor.
Shirt tailor. I had a friend that was a tailor that used that. It's really like something you'd find in a nice ready-to-wear shirt.
And it goes through the laundry time after time and never wrinkles. Some of the fusibles will wrinkle up and it'll show through your fabric. This never does.
You did a beautiful job. Let's see another one here. So this would be would this be the same shirt body, and then you put another treatment on? All right. Now this one has no batting in it.
No, this again is Seminole patchwork on here.
Oh, it's wonderful. Look at these. Oh,
And these I bought when I was at a seminar in Phoenix.
good
these
for
little
you.
things.
I hope this is your shirt. I wouldn't
Well,
want to let anybody else wear this. And I mean, this is really, so you can just see how this one has the pockets, but the two shirts, although the same pattern, look very different. And just, I love the way you just put a little bit on and don't do the entire garment.
Right. Well, I think that it all has to belong together. It
Right.
really disturbs me when I see a jacket or a shirt going down the street with a bullseye in the middle of the back and nothing else belongs to it.
I agree.
know.
Let's see some of your others. You know, I haven't done quilted garments because I never thought about just doing little areas. Now look at this. This is
Now,
out of this world.
This is a kimono style jacket.
Right.
This is what my own design here.
Oh,
I've
it's
done
terrific.
dozens of these. They tie under here so it's nice and this comes close to being one size fits all. But
Right. I can
not
see anyone
always.
would look
It's,
good in this. Now, is this the, is it the 3 ounce?
This is the 3-ounce bag.
Okay, and yet you don't have it down here, which is nice because you tend not to want something so bulky on the sleeve.
Right. Uh-huh.
Beautiful. Let's look at the back.
And the back nose.
Oh my. I mean, now tell me, do you have that same batting between here? Because I see you've done this channel stitching, which
Yes,
is really nice.
I did there because, other way, I would have to make a separate piece across here.
Right.
This way I could do the
whole
patchwork
piece.
and quilt the back.
Well, I
and
really like it because it's real effective because of the fact that, you know, the rest is not done like
yeah,
this.
then it eliminates the bulk under here by not doing
Very
this.
nice, very nice. Let's see some more. Now you're going to get me
This
all
is
hopped up
basically
about
the
quilting.
same-
Oh,
the
it's
same
beautiful.
pattern,
Okay, now this is cotton
done a little
velveteen.
different. Yes,
Oh, all right. Now, this one you made the quilting and then you top stitched through the batting afterward.
No.
Okay, how did you do
This
this?
is a strip quilting technique where you lay one piece on, sew it, turn it down, lay the next one on, sew
Okay,
it down.
but the
like that.
batting is in there as well as you're
The
doing
batting
it.
and the backing,
Oh, and
all
the
done at
backing.
one
So it's a
time.
one step because I love the depth you get from this.
Yeah, and the pieces, these particular pieces I made first, then trimmed them, made them larger, then cut them with the pattern piece, then sewed it into the rest of the garment.
It's beautiful, really. Now, does this color sell? The reason I ask, I have a friend, I'm always looking for this color, and he said brown doesn't sell. You know,
Well,
and
this is a little different brown. It's more,
Right.
it goes into the rust, you know, so.
isn't this something? All right, here once again now, instead of just stitching straight up and down, you want to cross
Right.
into a V.
I kind of wanted to
And
carry
all
out
of
the-
this ends up being very slimming with these kind of seams in there. Very nice. And I noticed how on the inside of the pocket, you've used a little bit of your lining fabric. Very nice.
Yeah, they're all finished so that you could wear them wrong side
oh,
out
I
if you
see.
wanted to. See, it's complete. There are
Let's
no raw
see.
edges anywhere.
Now, this is something I feel so important. How to do it completely, I mean, that's really the sign of a beautiful garment when it's perfect. I mean, that's just as attractive on the wrong side. Beautiful. Very,
Your
very.
quilting shows through, and everything is finished. It's all, of course, there's. By
Now, do
doing
you
it-
do the bottom hand hem by machine or you do it by hand? Oh, it looks like you've done
this-
it by hand.
I
think.
did a bias from
Strip.
the lining fabric, sewed it on, and then turned it up and bind stitched it by hand.
Looks good. Looks good. Well, all your handwork, it's worth it. Let's see this. Oh, my. This is.
This is a.
Let's see the purple one. Very nice. So now, all right, I see you've got buttons here, and that always means buttonholes, and you have success doing buttonholes right through the batting and everything.
Right. And to tell the truth on this one, I can't remember if I had I must have had an interfacing behind there. I can't
Okay,
really feel
I
it,
always
but
ask
can't
everyone I
remember.
know, have you got any buttonhole tricks for this, or does your machine just do nice ones?
It does nice buttonholes.
Oh, it's because
you
they
know.
look great.
I've been very fortunate as far as buttonholes are concerned.
And now you've got the little pocket right in here. Now this one is quilted throughout, but it's interesting because you've just done the different color. It's end up not looking so
Right, now
quilted.
these cuffs
And
are
they-
meant to be turned back.
All
here.
right. So you have a little bit of an edging on there. All right. Now this is a different pattern than your shirt pattern. This has this
Right,
little.
right.
Now I always think the square armhole does very well with quilted things.
Yes, it does. It's easier to put in, you know.
Right. And it goes with the squares.
Right.
Now, is the batting the only interfacing in here?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Let's see the back.
This, of course, like you said, the entire project
It's
is quilted
beautiful,
here.
though. And
But
because the
it's-
stripes go up and down,
It's slenderized.
very
you know.
slimming, right. Let's take a, I really am enjoying these.
This
Now-
one I just finished this
Oh,
morning.
this is out of this world. Now, denim has become a classic fabric, hasn't it? You know, this
Well, it
reminds me
really
of a
has.
mattress ticking denim. This is beautiful. Now, men's patterns. Who do you start with? When you start with the men's pattern, you try a birder, you start with a Vogue?
This one is a stretch and sew pattern.
Stretch. Now, what interfacing do you have in that? You've got
I have in the collar and the cuffs,
shirt maker again? Our
I
favorite.
have the shirt tailor.
Shirt tailor, I'm
Shirt
sorry,
tailor,
okay.
yeah.
And then it seems like there's nothing under this, no batting at all under this piece.
Yes, there's batting under this.
Just a little, I guess, because it's a little heavier and you've used corduroy.
Now, this jacket is not lined.
Right. But you wouldn't need it lined. I mean, but it's
Well,
fit.
don't
Oh, now
really,
look at
but-
this. How can you say this is not lined? Look at the back.
Well, it's
Let's turn it around. Oh, this is a great pattern, a great design that you've done. Did you do this little work here?
no, that was a printed denim I've had for I don't know how many years, and I saw
That's
that little
great.
piece. And I thought, well, work right there.
Well, you certainly do nice work, and you can see why these sell, because there's been special attention paid to all the details. The corners are sharp. It's well pressed. This is what really makes a difference. Well, thank you very much. Many women are small in the upper chest. That means the area from the armhole to the neck. This jacket kind of exemplifies this. There's just, if this is a typical thing with you, there just seems to be too much fabric from the armhole up. I'm going to show you a simple alteration on a pattern that you can change to fix that up. Probably 85% of the individuals should be using this because you have a larger size pattern down below and you're broad in the back, but you just need a big chunk of fabric removed from here. Let's take it out of the pattern first, and then you can see that we won't have it, then we'll just ease it to the shoulder. Now I've got a pattern piece here. This would be an American pattern. And just decide how much you'd like to get rid of. A typical thing would be getting rid of a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. And what I've drawn an L on the pattern, and I've cut it at the bottom so that that will enable me to be able to fold out the amount that I need. So it can be anywhere 1/2 inch, a whole inch, however much I want to take it in on the front. Now, when I do that, you can see that that makes the armhole longer in the front. So I also have to add to the sleeve front only, so that when I put these two together, do you see I'll have a little longer area in the front, so it'll match up with this area. Now, how do I work it out in the back? This will be smaller than the back piece when it comes in. You can either run an ease line along the back, or if you're really taking a lot out, for example, if you're taking a whole inch out of the front, then you'd want to put a small dart in the back. But don't just cut it off, run an ease line or do a dart in the back. Now let's see what we do if we were using a European pattern. This is a European pattern, and you would use, let's say you'd use your bust size from the armhole down, and then maybe you go out or in, depending upon your size for the hip. But what size are we going to cut in the upper chest? I find with European patterns, most people like it to cut it 2 sizes smaller from the armhole to the neck. And then whatever size you use at the armhole, you also use that at the neck. So you're using the same size at the neck and right to the bottom of the armhole, and then you come out for your bust size. These are 2 very easy alterations that I think will make a big difference. If you're going to spend all this time on the beautiful fabric, you want to make sure it fits. And a real good thing is to pre-test a pattern in a scrap fabric, because this will be a real beautiful garment, and you don't want to keep taking out all the stitches. So it'd be worth it to do this. For better accuracy when cutting bulky fabrics like this handwoven, what you want to do is trim off the excess tissue beyond the cutting line because you'll get a much better cut. And also, rather than trying to use pins, which will tear the pattern tissue, I find I like to use pattern weights. Now you can buy these, or you can use tuna fish cans, or whatever you want. Just something to hold it into position while you cut. Now, it is useless to cut on any sort of notches because you're going to just simply cut those off. How are we going to use any pattern markings? Because pattern markings are important. What I like to use to mark the notches are these adhesive dots. And what I do is I take one of them off, and if I've got a notch here, I'll lift up the pattern and I'll have an arrow pointing to the place of the notch. So what I end up with is something like this. And if the notches in a European pattern are numbered, I can number them. But you see, I don't have the notches marked on. I just have them marked with these little dots. Now, with something like this, which is a pocket, I would have to mark those with tailor's tacks. Now, if you would like the hand-woven fabric to appear like a very crisp fabric so you can really tailor it, then you have to do something to this. What we want to do is we want to fuse some interfacing to it so that it gives a crispness. Now, what I did on this jacket is I have fused every piece. So what I did is took something like sew shear and I put it on the back of every piece. I'll show you what I'm talking about. Now, here's an example of something. I cut out the jacket. Then I cut out, it's called sew shear, or one of the fusible knit interfacings, and I fused it to the entire back. And so I'm actually going to tailor this jacket with a lapel, so I've got the roll line. So once I fuse it, I can treat it like a regular fabric. Now, you do have to do something though. You either have to pre-shrink the interfacing, like I've done here, then I can cut it on the straight of the grain, or you have to cut it on the bias. And I don't know whether you can see, this is another jacket, and I've got interfacing fused to the back, and this is on the bias. So you can either pre-shrink it or put it on the bias, but have you ever noticed how when you fuse something it gets smaller? And that's because it hasn't been pre-shrunk. So pre-shrinking is just putting it in hot water for 15 minutes and then hang over the shower pole to dry. Then it's pre-shrunk. But if you haven't done that, then you can cut it on the bias. This is what the industry does. They cut it on the bias and fuse it, and then it doesn't draw it up. Now we'll go to the iron, and I will show you actually how to fuse something and make it accurate. Now, fusing, what we're going to do is that we'd fuse every piece of the garment if that's what the look we wanted, every piece. In this case, we're doing the collar. So this is the collar. And then I've got some fusible interfacing. This is sew shear, or you could use fusy knit. And I've cut it on the bias, and now I'm going to lay it down. And I try to make the handwoven conform to the shape of the interfacing, since the interfacing is the more stable of the two. Now I'll lay my press cloth on it. I like a press cloth that will absorb moisture. You can use an old napkin or a dishcloth or cheesecloth. I sprayed it. Now, medium-high iron, you hold it on here, supposedly to the count of 10. I don't think many of us remember to do that. So just do it long enough so you can see that the press cloth isn't damp. Now, this is really when it's wonderful to have a big Elna press, because you can see if you're doing a lot of fusing of the whole garment, it makes it much faster to just put it under the press, which actually beeps in 10 seconds, so it tells you when it's 10. Now, all right, I look at this. Now I'll turn it over to the other side. See, I fused it with the fusible up. Now, for long-term fusible, what you want it to do, if you really want it to be on there a long time, which we do, then we'll do the same process again to the other side. All right, now remember, your iron isn't too hot. It's medium-high, and it should be approximately to the count of 10. But if you lift up the iron, you can usually tell when it's no longer, when the press cloth is no longer damp. Now I lift this up, and if you can see that it's not exactly accurate. Here's my handwoven, and here's my fusible interfacing. Which one am I going to pay attention to? I'm going to pay attention to the fusible interfacing because I know that the handwoven has a little bit of a saggy, baggy treatment to it. So then I can actually cut it off so that the handwoven matches the size of the fusible interfacing. And you see, I did keep the fusible in the seam allowances. So I will be paying attention to the size of the interfacing, not the hand woven. Then I also cut the under collar. Now, because this fabric is kind of bulky, instead of using the same fabric, the hand woven for the under collar, what I've done is I've used another fabric. I can use a lightweight wool or a lightweight linen that I've also fused some interfacing to, so that the two together, when I make the collar, they won't be so bulky. Now, stay tape is very important to maintain the shape of the shoulder and the shape of the neckline. If you don't do this, the weight of the fabric will pull on the sleeve and it'll make it saggy, and that gives you that saggy, baggy look. So we want it to maintain its shape. It's especially important at the shoulder and the neckline. You never stay tape up and down seams, vertical seams, just the neckline and the shoulder. Now we're going to take and measure the stay tape from the pattern piece. So I want it the exact length. See, otherwise I don't know what I'm trying to match it up to. So I'll take now, on my neckline, I have to put the twill tape on, stand it straight up so I can see the exact size. So I come around here like this, and then I'll cut that. So now I have a length for the shoulder, and I have some for the neck. Now I'll take the pattern off, and what I want to do next is I want to sew the twill tape on here before I actually start constructing the garment. So what I'll do now is I'll pin this right along the seam line, it's on the wrong side, and make the hand woven conform to the size of the twill tape. Now see, this one is a fairly stable hand woven, but other ones, you can find that if you don't put this twill tape on there, you can have a neckline stretch an entire inch or 2 inches, and then it's never going to look right. So what I do is I always start at the ends in my pinning, and then I work in toward the middle, so that I make sure that this is the exact size. So now I'm going to sew this at 5/8, now that I've got it pinned on. So now, just using a regular length stitch, we'll sew our twill tape onto the shoulder and onto the neckline. And then from then on, we don't have to worry about this stretching it. Now, the twill tape can go on whether or not we fused or not. You always put twill tape. This piece I didn't fuse interfacing to, but you can see sometimes you can just fuse to certain parts of the garment. I usually fuse to the front always, so this could be the back piece. And I want it a little softer, so I've just put the twill tape on the shoulder and the neck, but I would use twill tape whether or not I had fused. It wouldn't make any difference. Now, if you don't own a serger, I'm going to show you a couple of other alternative methods in a few minutes, but if you haven't already purchased a serger, you might consider purchasing one with differential feed. That means it feeds evenly on the top and the bottom, and if you have a lot of if you work with hand wovens or bulky quilted fabrics, a differential feed's wonderful. Now, if you don't have it, I'll show you how to work around that. So now what do we want to do with this? Well, all right, the one thing we want to have is we want to have woolly nylon in the upper looper. Okay, the upper looper only woolly nylon because it's a little bit spongy and it gives a nice soft finish. If you can look at the two threads, this is regular thread and this is woolly nylon. Now you can see this is a little spongier, and so consequently it's going to be softer and it gives the seam much more flexibility. This is only in the upper looper. But I may need a dental floss threader. You can buy them just right where you buy the toothbrushes in order to thread it through the eyes, because you can see this end is kind of fat and that's going to have a hard time getting through the eye. So a dental floss threader like this makes it a lot easier to work with. We also want to make the stitch width wider so that it doesn't just surge off the edge and pull away from the fabric. So we'll alter that so that that's wider wherever you do that on your machine. All right, so now what we need to do is one last thing. If I go ahead and try to serge this, it's going to push the edge ahead and make it wavy. So I want to reduce the pressure on the upper foot. And you know, you do this on this machine, this is an old white, by just unscrewing it. You can even take the screw out. It doesn't make a difference, but you want to make it very loose. Now we'll begin to serge. Now, the important thing is not to stretch the fabric as you work. Kind of let it feed in on its own. Now, what we'll do is we'll do a piece of this and we'll see how it looks. And I'm not having any trouble with it. And how do I know? I take a look at it and I see if it's stretching the outside edge. Now, if in fact that it's stretching and this gets very wavy, then I want to show you what you could do. That means you haven't been able to reduce enough pressure on the foot. So then what I do is I put my finger behind the presser foot, and as I sew, the fabric will push against my finger and it won't be able to come out as fast. So what I'll do is it'll actually be easing it together, but it'll keep it from stretching. You see how my finger has these little pieces of fabric behind it? I just push a fold and I keep it from stretching as I go. So all of my pieces, so you can see, let's see, I'll feed this out of here, that now my edge is not in any way stretched. Now, even if I have fused my piece, I may in fact have fused all of them, but it doesn't make any difference. I still want to run the serger around all those edges as well. These are very easy to control because they have fusible interfacing on the back, but in either case, I want to serge them as well. So all my pieces, before I begin, I put my interfacing on all my pieces, then I go to the serger and I serge them all, and what that'll do is that'll just give it a nice finish. Now remember, if you don't have a serger, you don't have to give up. I'm going to give you some alternate seam finishes in just a minute. Now, after we've fused any pieces that we want to give extra stability to, like the front and like the facing, or maybe in case of the whole thing, you can fuse the whole thing, then we serged all the pieces. Now we're going to come to constructing the garment, so we come over to the regular machine. Now we need a needle, an 80-12 H needle, so that's a sharp needle of a medium size. You also want to put your machine at a narrow zigzag, and what I do for that is I use 0.5 millimeters, so it's a very small zigzag, but that will give the seam some stretchability so it can relax. And you also want to lengthen your stitch slightly. If you usually sew with 2.5, you might want to put it on 3. So now we've got a very narrow zigzag. It's a little bit, not a basting stitch, but a little bit longer stitch. Now, if you can reduce the pressure on the pressure foot. If not, what you want to do, this one has a dual feed. You can use a dual feed or you can use the even feed foot, but something so that the top layer doesn't push ahead so much. So we're ready to sew the first seam, so we've got the 2 layers together. So we'll just sew at a 5/8 seam allowance. And you can see I'm not having any trouble with it. Neither piece are fused here, and I'm not having any trouble with it stretching ahead. If you do not have a dual feed, and you have a roller foot, that will work, or a Teflon foot, but let's say you don't have either one of those, and when you sew this, let's say you have a real old-time machine. When you sew this, it's starting to get ripply. You can tell that it's stretching. Then put your finger behind the presser foot. But if you have a newer machine, okay, and you kind of push it in the way I did on the serger, but if you have a newer machine, and you have a dual feed or an even feed foot, you don't need to do that. All right. Now, after I sew my first seam, this is just I'm going to give you choices of many kinds of seam allowances. Now, this is one we'll just take and we'll press it open. Now, some hand wovens, that's all you need to do is press it open, and it will get nice and flat. But in the case of this one, this fabric is a little bit spongy, so in order to flatten it out completely, I will take and top stitch on both sides. So I've pressed the seam open, and then I just use the presser foot as a guide, and I just go down one side and then back up the other. And now you shouldn't have any stretching at all. I'm not having any problems with this because of the fact that I've got it feeding properly, the top and the bottom. So you can see how this seam looks. It's top stitched on both sides. So if you can take a look, this is how it looks. It's kind of like a little bit of a welted seam. It's a real nice look. It's a good one for any fabrics that are bulky. Now let's use another seam, let's use another way of doing it with something that's not so bulky.
Action.
Now this would be a typical seam treatment where you'd have a princess seam where the entire front would be fused and then you'd be putting it together, let's say, with an unfused piece. And we've got two reverse curves, one that's going in and one that's going out. And even though I have fused this and serged it, I want to clip the inside curve slightly so that it can follow the shape of the outside curve. Now this I'm going to do a little bit differently. Because of the fact that one is fused and one is not, we know that the one that's fused is going to be the one that's more stable. So I'll put the fused one on the top. It's an interesting thing, but you always sew with the problem one on the bottom. It makes it a lot easier. And the feed dog will just ease that one to the size. So I'm not having any problems with it because I have my fused one on the top and I just follow the shape of the curve. Now this one is not so bulky. I could press this open if I wanted to. Let's see. But this is another seam finish you can use. Instead of pressing it open, you can press it all to one side and then top stitch it. So that's what I'll do on this one. I'll press it to one side, and usually there's a direction that it wants to go. It seems to be that you don't want to double back over the interface part. So I usually press that one flat, and then you press it, and then you always, when you do your top stitching with these bulky fabrics, you sew from the top side. Now all the fabrics I've been showing you are hand wovens because they're the ones that are the most difficult, but you can see I'm not having any difficulty with this. And I've just top stitched it, and you can take a look at how this seam looks. It's nice and flat, and it came to one side. Now why did I put this one to one side? Because this was a little lighter weight. The other one I pressed open. You don't want to take a bulky fabric and press it to one side, only one that's not so bulky, as I did in this case. I want to do something to make the seams look nice, and I call this a flashy seam finish. So I'll show you how I do this now. And it's nice to do it in a contrasting color, because if you're going to go to all this work, you want to get lots of attention so people know that you did it, because it's a nice finish. Now, with this one, what I've done so far is I just took the seam, sewed it, and pressed it open. Now you see it's got the little overlocked part on this. So this could be finished, but I feel that overlock seams on an unlined jacket are not the look of a real expensive coat. So instead, you might want to purchase some of this. It's called extra wide bias tape, double fold, like this. It takes usually 2 or 3 packages to do a jacket. 2 will usually do it. Now, if you open it up with this tape, you will see that this tape has a fat side and a skinny side. What we want to do is we want to put the fat side on the back. So I'm going to cup this tape around on each side of the seam allowance. So what this is doing is this is wrapping the seam allowance. Now the question is, would I have had to overlock this if I'm going to do this with every seam? Not really, except if it was very loose woven. This could be something that you could do if you didn't have a serger. You could do this sort of thing. I usually just get in the habit of overlocking it first. So do you see, and then on the other side, I'll just take and I'll cup it around. Now you put the big side on the back so that when you're sewing from the top side, in case you miss, do you see, that means you don't have to sew it exactly perfect because the bigger one is on the back and it'll catch in. So now let's go to the machine and sew it in place. And the fact that there's a larger one from the back, it makes it no problem if I miss it. Now I'm not doing it in matching thread. Naturally you'd be using the purple thread. But it's a very simple thing. It doesn't take much time at all. The important thing is always in this situation, don't stretch. You don't want to stretch it. But this gives just a real nice finish. So you can see, and then I would do the other side, and then that's it. Now, would I have to top stitch this seam? Not necessarily. This looks pretty flat. This is up to you. If you want a tailored feeling, you can top stitch it, but this is laying pretty flat, so it's not absolutely necessary to top stitch it. Now another alternative, if you don't have a serger, is to use something called seams grate. It comes in a little roll, and see how it's stretchy like this. Now, you're going to probably wondering, well, why didn't I mention zigzag? I find with a hand woven, if you do zigzag, it seems to stretch it and makes it curl. So this is a little better, unless you put the seams grate on. So I find it's easier just to do it, don't pin it all on, but just work on it on the machine. Now, I'm going to increase the width of my zigzag a little bit so that it goes on, since I haven't serged this at all, so I have a little extra support. So what I do is I take this, there's usually a direction with which this curls. Is I've got a medium width zigzag, and I've got an even feed foot on, Teflon, roller foot, something to keep this from stretching. And now I've just got the zigzag, and I'm zigzagging the seams grate onto it. And now you can see what that looks like. And see, that's not going to pull off. So then once you would do that, then you'd go ahead and sew all your seams in a traditional way. So on the inside, you would see the seams grate instead of an overlock seam or the flashy seam finish. But this is also another technique if you don't have a serger. Now this is a strap seam, and this is a way that you can enclose the seam allowances. You don't have to have a serger now. The seam allowances are going to be hidden, and you can decorate the seam at the same time. And it's really a nice technique. So instead of putting right sides together to do this, you put wrong sides together, so you can see that the seam allowances are peeking out up here. Now we have a strip that we're going to cover it with. So you cut it 2.5 inches wide, and then you fold in 5/8 and 5/8 so that it looks like this. So we folded in the raw edges, and then we lay it on here and top stitch it. All right? So here's one if I wanted to do it on this blue one. Do you see? Now, I could lay, now this one, do you see, I'd have to cut this a little wider, all right, because they're peeking out. The seam allowances are peeking out here. So in that case, what I would have probably done is cut the seam allowances down if I wanted to do that later. But the typical technique is just to sew it together, wrong sides together, press the seams open, and then you can trim them down slightly if you want to, and then just lay this on the top and top stitch it. It really makes a nice look. You can also do this with ultra suede or ultra leather. It gives a nice quality finish to it. Now this is a wonderful seam treatment if you're willing to take a little extra trouble. You're going to fringe the seam allowances. So you sew the seam allowances, just sew the seam. Now the seam allowance, you haven't done any special treatment. And then you begin to ravel off the extra. All right? So what I have is you have to have something that has a fair amount of fringe to it. But you sew the seam, then and so you have your wrong sides together, and then when the seam allowances are sticking out, then you ravel, and what you get is a beautiful seam treatment like this. Or you can take the seam allowances and sew them like this so that they're right sides together out, and then fringe it away and top stitch it so they go to one side. There's some really wonderful treatments you can do with fringe. And you might just want to do some of the seam allowances like this, maybe the ones in the front, or maybe the princess seam that goes down the front of the back, but it's a nice technique. We're going to do a different treatment on the neckline. Now, this one opens at the shoulder. You could also have one that opened at the zipper. And you can see what I do is I have on here is I have the twill tape to stabilize the neckline. And what I have is I have a piece of knit. You can use a piece of knit or you can use a piece of bias, but something with a little bit of a stretch. And this piece was cut 2 inches wide, and I folded under 1/2 inch, or, you know, it could be 5/8, it doesn't make any difference. Now, what I want to do is I want to enable this neckline to conform, so I'm going to have to clip the curves a little bit. So I just take a couple little clips around the curve even before I start putting this on here. Now, I don't want to miss the neckline, which, remember, I did the stay tape there. So I'm going to put it now right sides together, but I'm going to be sewing like this with the twill tape side up so that I can see exactly where I stitched before. So here's the fold of the fabric. So I'm putting the raw edges together. So I've got the right side of the knit or of the bias against the right side of the neckline. And now I will come around and I will sew the neckline right on top of the original stitching where I used the stay tape, which was at 5/8. Now I'm sewing this with a straight stitch because I don't want any stretch at the neckline at all. But as I sew this, I am going to stretch this knit or this bias slightly because I want to have a little bit of a finish around the neck, but I don't want the finish to stick out. So what I do is give it a slight stretch as I sew it on here, just pulling a little bit from the back. Now, after I do that, then I'll take and I'll cut my seam allowance down to almost nothing, maybe 1/4 of an inch. And then I go and clip the seams. Now, even though this is a hand woven, I'm not worried about it because I've sewn it. Now, I come around to the back. There's a fold. Remember the fold that pressed in? So then I bring it around and I wrap it to the wrong side. Now, there are a couple ways I can do this. This is probably the nicest looking way to do it. Now you can see, you can see my twill tape. Now I wouldn't use twill tape on this. If this were a garment I were going to wear, I just did it so you could see it. I would probably use, instead of twill tape, a little piece of selvage from a lining that, that went along with the color, so that the selvage will be the same thing. It'll stabilize the neck, but you won't have that little bit showing there. So see, I just bring the fold down. Now what this is going to look like on the outside is it's going to look like this. So what I have to do now is to take and run a hand stitch around. All right, so now I do little stitches about every 1/4 to a 1/2 inch. Take one stitch on the knit piece, and then I ride it along at the fold. And then where am I going to catch it? I catch it right on the seam line there. So right the seam where I sewed it. And I don't just overcast it because then you can see the stitching. I hide the stitch by sliding my needle along the fold and then taking one stitch right at the seam that initially sewed this on there. Now, I'll just do a couple more stitches and then we'll turn it around and we'll see what it looks like from the other side. And you'll see why I wanted to stretch the piece slightly as I sewed. Now, let's turn it over. And you can see the right side. Now, what would be the next step? The next step would be to go over to the iron and press it. Now, ordinarily, I would cover this with a press cloth, but then you can't see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to spray it a little bit with water. I've got it, since it's at the neckline, I have it on the ham. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the clapper to flatten it out. And I'm shaping it on the ham. Now you can see, even without much fiddling here, can you see what a nice look that gives around the neck? Now you wouldn't ordinarily see the stitching. I just use contrasting color thread, but you wouldn't see the stitching. And do you see how this lays nice and flat? If I hadn't stretched this slightly, it would fit the neck, but it would stick out like this. We want it to conform to the neckline. And then on the back, you just see the little hand stitches, and ordinarily you wouldn't have the white twill tape. You'd use just a colored selvage. I think then it would be more subtle. But it's a great way to finish a neck without any bulk. You can use lots of different types of fabric. You can even use ultra leather because it has 4-way stretch and it gives you the same stretch as the knit. So it has to be something that stretches a little bit. Bias works as well. Now you can't always eliminate facings because this is a type of situation where it's an unlined jacket, but I have the facing, do you see, that finishes off the edge around the neck and down the front. Now what kind of thing would I do for this? In this case, remember this wide bias tape that I did the flashy seam finish? It also makes a great finish for the facing. Do you see? You can merely cup this around the outside edge. And this is just like I did on the seam, but it's a way, can you see how it's a way to finish the outside edge so it looks professional? I think it just looks a lot better than an overlocked edge to see something like this on the inside. It just looks a lot more professional. So this would be a way that you would finish the edge, and you can also finish it at the top of the hem as well with just this extra wide bias tape or bias that you made on your own, and then you just sew it on. Have you ever noticed how when you go to turn up a hem in something, it always seems like there's more hem than there is garment, and it's kind of bulky? Let's look at this garment on the table, and I'll give you an example. If we went to press up the hem in this garment, we'll match the seams. Do you see how we've got a problem here, don't we? It's too much. So how are we going to settle that? Are we going to pleat it over and have it be bulky? That's not very professional looking. So let me show you how you can take and ease this out before you put up your hem. So we'll go to the machine, and what I'm going to be doing, it's one of the most useful things I've ever learned. It's a method of easing. It's called Stay Stitch Plus or crimping. You put your finger behind the presser foot, and we're going to be sewing. We put our stitch a little bit longer because this is heavy fabric, so it's almost like a basting stitch. And can you see how my finger is behind the foot, pushing in and easing? So what it's doing is, you'll be able to see, and remember, just pull it out gently. Can you see how that made it a little bit, it brought it in. It's not pleated, but it's ruffled a little bit. Now we'll go over to the iron. We'll put our hem up, just fold it up. And before we do anything else, what we're going to do is we're going to, with some steam, do you see how I'm flattening out the hem? Do you see? So now it fits perfectly, and I don't have any bulk around the bottom. So you just, now if you haven't mastered that, you can also pull up a little basted thread, but you see how it's perfectly matched now? Even though the hem is exactly bigger, it was bigger when it started, now it matches perfectly. Now, once we've pressed the hem up and we're happy with the way it looks, okay, a couple of things. We want to take and cut the seam allowances out of the hem. We don't need them in there, and it's just too bulky, so we might as well cut the seam allowance out of the hem. Now, if the garment is going to be lined, then we can put a little piece of interfacing behind here so it would cover it up. A lot of hand wovens, you wouldn't want to do this if it's not fused the entire way. I usually don't interface the hem because it makes the hem too rigid. So we'll just do the hem. We won't put the piece of interfacing in. Now, if you fuse the entire piece, then that would be fine. But now what we want to do is do some sort of finish on here to make it look nice. Now, to do a Hong Kong finish, what you have to have is you have to have a piece of bias. This is lining, or you could use, this is actually China silk, but something off grain. It can't be straight of the grain because it has to mold to the shape of the hem. So it either has to be bias or well off grain. Now, this is a 1-inch strip, and we're going to take this now and place this right side of the strip against the edge of the hem, the two raw edges together, and we're going to sew at 1/4 inch. Not stretching any of it, just allowing the feed dog to feed it in there, and you're going to sew it at 1/4 inch. And you know, this is a nice place to do a contrasting color because this is a real pretty finish, I think. All right, now after we've sewn it 1/4 inch, then our next thing to do is to trim it down to 1/8 inch. Now you're going to ask me, why didn't I just sew it 1/8 inch to begin with? Because I find when you try to sew 1/8 inch, it pulls it down into the feed dog and it knots up there. So I just find by doing it at 1/4 and then trimming it to 1/8, I have a lot better luck. Now I'm going to press this on the iron and I flatten it down. See? Because what I want to do next is I want to wrap this around toward the back. See how I just take the edge now, here's my raw seam here, and I wrap it around and pin it in the well of the seam to the underside. And what this does is this finishes the raw edge, covers up that little Stay Stitch Plus line that we did, and just gives a real pretty finish. Now, what we're going to do next is to sew in the well of the seam or stitch in the ditch. Now, if you're not good at this, get on one side or the other. I find the stitch usually gets lost more in the woven fabric than it does if I do it on the lining fabric. So, I will take this now and sew in the well of the seam, and what I'm doing is I'm really sewing right next to the well. I've never been very good at sewing in the well. I guess I don't look carefully enough. So I'm sewing it right next to it, and what I'm ending up with is a very nice binding for my hem. Now this is also something that you can do to finish off the facing. Remember where I showed you how to use that wide bias tape? Well, if you're using the Hong Kong finish on the hem, it's a nice technique to use the Hong Kong finish also on the facing. So now this is how it looks. Now we'll take a look at the hem like this. We'll turn it up. Now, see, it's a little raw edge there. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to cut it off. You don't have to do anything to it. Now, this is now ready to be hemmed. Now, the reason I remember when I did the ease and then I went and pressed it. Why did I bother to press it first? Why didn't I just do the Stay Stitch Plus, that easing, and then put this on? Because I have done that, and sometimes you do too much easing and it gets too small. So it's good to do the easing, go to the iron and press, and then add your little Hong Kong finish, and then you know it's the right size. I can't stress the importance of pressing enough. That's what really makes a difference between something that looks professional and something that doesn't. Now the first thing, this is a collar. What we want to do is sometimes you can't get in a collar to press it open. And this way, see, I'm just pressing the seam back on itself. Somehow I want to open this up before I trim and press it back as much as I can. Then what you want to do is you want to do grading. Now this is a collar, and what I have is one side is a hand woven and one side is a lighter weight fabric. Both of these are interfaced, and so what I want is the longer one to be on top so it can actually cushion the underneath one. So what I'll do is I go around here now and I trim all the way around at 1/4 inch. Now the under one I want to make smaller, so I go around there and trim that one 1/8 inch. Okay, now I've trimmed the seam allowances down. Now I take the collar and I turn it right side out. And then before I go down to the iron, one of the things I like to do is to baste it. See, I've got an outside and I've got the underside of the collar. I don't want this underside of the collar to show. So if I try to press this now, it's going to be difficult to favor it. So I find if I just run a basting line around, you see how I'm just pushing this one to the back so that I don't see any of that under collar. And I find that it's well worth the few seconds in hand basting, because when I go to press this, it's going to make it very, very easy to press. All right, I'll do half of it. I'll do some with basting and some without, and you'll see what I'm talking about. If I try to press this without basting now, here's how I'm going to have to do it. First of all, I'm going to have to forget totally about a press cloth because I'm going to have to favor it like this. On this particular one, it wouldn't be so bad, But a lot of times you'll get a shine, and if you've got shiny threads, it would ruin it. If you've taken the time to do the basting, then you can simply put the press cloth on it, spray it, and then all detailing the clapper, an essential part for anyone who wants it to look real professional. We press it, and then we hit it with the clapper. And what you're going to see is that, do you see how crisp that edge gets? And then you can just take your basting out, and that's it. You know, a good shoulder pad makes all the difference in the world, and it's not to make your shoulders look broad, but it's to square off the shoulder so that the garment can hang properly. Now what we want to do is, I've got a little square of this interfacing, and I just want to take and fold it over like this. Now, I don't press the pad flat. I take it, and I usually start it like this. I'll start pressing on the inside of the pad. Turn my iron down just a little bit for this. And then, because if I press it flat, what happens is that builds in that shape that I don't want. See, I want it to be shaped toward the body. So now I press it a little bit on the top. And we can always take a little dart out of this interfacing by hand in a few minutes, which I'll show you. So now we've taken this, and I'll cut this like this. And what you see is, I've got a pad like this. I've got some on the inside, and now I can do a little more work. So here's one that I've done, the other one that matches this. And what I did down here at the end, you see how it just forms a little pleat at the end. And then you can go around and you can overlock the whole edge. But you can see, you can get a nicer, you've given that pad that was kind of a nothing pad, you've given it a real nice shape. And you can see when it goes in the garment, it'll be much nicer. Now this pad's kind of long. Don't feel like you can't trim it off. I mean, you can do anything to these things you want. That's the great thing about sewing. You can make it, see, so it's more to your size. Now then, after you do this, you can cover it, if you want, cover it with a piece of fabric like this, or you can even just put it inside the same way it is. Sometimes, I mean, if you don't mind taking the time, a pad looks really nice covered. Now this is a shirt. Where would I put the pad in the shirt? What I would do is I try it on, and I see where the pad fits the best. If it's on the shoulder, if you have a little shoulder joint there, the pad extends out a ½ inch. If you have a shoulder seam on a garment, you always push the edge of the pad out a ½ inch past the end. Now, so I'm putting this in, and I'd pin it in, and I would try it on, and usually I figure the pad is about half and half. So I lie that right on the shoulder seam, and then I pin it in, and then I try it on, and I say, okay, do I want to push it out further or bring it in further? Now, how then will I put the pad on? It's very easy to take it now. Once it's been pinned in, just start a knot on the underside, see, like this. And the only place I sew a pad is right in the shoulder seam. So what I'll do is I slide it under there. See, I just do a hand stitch, and usually I'll do a double stitch, a double thread, which I'm not doing here, but I just pull down a double thread, so that the only place this pad will be attached will be at the shoulder seam. And that's whether the garment is lined or whether the garment is unlined. Now sometimes if the garment is like this, a big shirt, instead of sewing the pad in, I'll just put in a piece of Velcro, and then I can put any pad in there I want. But if you wanted to put this, really do a nice job on this garment, do you see how I'm just sliding? So my stitching, all it's doing is, it's going right along this shoulder seam. And it's invisible to see. And then on the inside of the pad, what's happening is you can just see there's a row of stitching there. So now I don't sew to the very end of the pad though. I sew to half inch before the end of the pad, and that'll give it a real nice shape. I find that by using a shoulder pad, it hangs well on the hanger and it hangs well on the body. It doesn't wrinkle when it's on the hanger. It just looks much different. I really think if you spend all the time on this wonderful fabric, you should definitely spend a little bit more on the shoulder pad. Button loops are an excellent way to take care of the closure problem on hand-woven garments and on quilted garments because they're kind of bulky. Let's see a couple examples of this so you can see how well it works. I could have put a bound buttonhole in, but instead I used a loop out of the crepe because it has a large button. I always feel a loop looks better with a large button because a bound buttonhole, when it gets too big, it's not so good. Now for these buttons, I didn't want to put a buttonhole, obviously, because it would be too thick. I just used some braid and made a small loop. And so when this buttons over, the trim merely butts together rather than overlapping. And so it's a nice way to treat something when you're using trim. Now the question is, what are we going to make these button loops out of? I really like to choose some really nice, there's some tremendous braid on the market. Nice little twisted braid, that seems to look more professional. Of course you could make your own, but with turning a little strip, but I just still think things like this look more professional. One of the things you don't want to use, there's a rayon trim called rat tail, and it frays, it's not strong enough. So one of these twisted braids are much better. They're not expensive, and I usually buy a couple, it's maybe 75 cents a yard. I keep a stock of this in my favorite color, so I always have something to make loops with. Now suppose you have an oddball fabric, kind of like this, and nothing really works that you can find. Then what you can do is you can, see, this would be another example of one. So then what you can do is unravel some threads like this. And what I did was I unraveled it so that I had 12 threads, and then I braided it together. Do you see? This is first of all, if you don't want to go to the store, you just don't want to go out, or you want to get something that's perfect. And can you see how by using the hand-woven its own threads, I used 12 of them, and I just braided using 4, 4, and 4. And then you can see that then you have a braided loop, and this will be perfect, and it'll be perfect with your fabric. Let's talk about what size loop you're going to make, and also how you're going to put the loop in the seam. An easy way to determine the size button loop I need to make is to take a little piece of twill tape or ribbon or anything and wrap it around the button like this. And that means I need this much to go through. That's what it's going to take. That's how big the loop has to be. So I'll put a pin there. And now I'll decide where I want the opening to be. Now often what I'll do is I'll sew the garment and then I'll decide later on I want a loop to be in there. Now this is not the professional loop, the one that sticks out. I think it looks much better to have a nice flat one that goes flat along the seam instead of one that sticks out. So let's say we decide to open up the seam. Let's say we want the button to be here. All right, now we've decided that this is the length of opening we want. So on either side of this, do you see? Because this will be one half of it, and the other half will be the jacket. So you can see how it's going to work. Now this is going to be the length of my loop. So you wrap this around a button, so that means the loop needs to be half that distance. So at this point, I open up the seam with some scissors on either end. And I'm going to slide in a piece of trim like this. And the other, I'll just trim off a little bit here and slide that in. Now, you see? Now what I'll do is on the wrong side from underneath, I'll pull this in so it's taut, so it's flat against the garment. See, I pulled it in, and so you can now see that it's flat against the garment like this. Now all I have to do is go and re-sew my seam. See, I opened it just a little bit to put in my trim, but what I usually do then is before I re-sew the seam, I pin it, and I make a little check. Before I re-sew the seam, I make a check, let's say this is my button, to make sure my button will fit through there. All right, now this is perfect. Now let's look at another buttonhole alternative. Would you ever make a regular machine buttonhole? If the buttons were not very large, I would make a machine buttonhole, but I'd also, this is not actually my preference. I usually use the loop, but sometimes on a shirt I would do a machine buttonhole. And one of the things I find with a fabric like a handwoven that has a tendency to stretch, I put a little cord in the buttonhole that I pull up and then cut off, and that keeps the buttonhole from stretching. And so you want, I usually use a shiny thread like a sulky thread and an 80/12 needle that's an end needle, so the shiny thread will go through, and then I cord the buttonhole. Now let's see another alternative to this buttonhole closure situation. Now the next buttonhole solution is one that I call a face buttonhole. This is really easy. It's a wonderful buttonhole to do on heavyweight fabric, and it kind of makes its own finish. I used it here on the felted jacket. You see it here? That's where I first devised the thing on this that was so heavy. And then since then, I've used it on a lot of other things, including here is a long vest. And okay, first of all, to make this long vest, all I did is I took a short vest pattern and I added 27 inches down. Now this is an example of the face buttonhole. It has a little slot on the front, and then on the back has like a little square, a little rectangle of leather. This is very easy to make, and I'll show you how to make it, and it's a wonderful solution to the closure problem on an unlined jacket or coat. Now, first of all, we want to determine where we're going to put this little opening, and it's usually between 3/4, it's your preference, to 1 inch away from the edge. So what I'll do is I'll just baste a thread there like this, and then I usually go up and down so I know that that's where I'm going to stop. So what I've essentially, it'd be the same thing you would do if you were going to do a pocket. You have the line across, and then you have the line where you want it to stop. All right, now, we're not putting any interfacing behind this buttonhole. Now, I've cut a rectangle of ultra leather, could be ultra suede, could be lots of different things, but I really find it looks nice if it's done in a fake leather, fake suede. And we're going to place it right sides against the garment. So then we turn it over so we can see our marking, and we're going to sew a rectangle. So now what I'm going to do now is to put my machine on small stitches, because what I want to do is I want to come down to the end of the opening, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 stitches on the end. So I walk it 3 stitches. If you want it narrower, you can do it even narrower. So now I'm coming down the other side, and as soon as I finish it, I'll show it to you. Then you hand walk, okay, you turn it around. So what I'm essentially doing is sewing a very small rectangle with tiny stitches. So here it is, right sides together now. All I did is I sewed a very tiny rectangle. If you want this little opening narrow, you can just hand walk it 2 stitches or 1 stitch across. I just came 3 stitches across because I like the little bit of the leather showing when I turn it through. So now I will open this up. This is when you know whether your scissors need sharpening. You know that Scissor Pro is a wonderful scissor sharpener. It's put out by the people that made the Chef's Choice knife sharpener, and it's really excellent. Now, do you see what I did is I cut into each corner. I don't know whether you can see here, but I've gotten really close in there so that I can turn this through. Because now what I want to do is turn this through now to the wrong side. Now the reason you have to have small stitches on there, if you didn't have small stitches, this hand woven is going to pull away. So now I can remove my basting, which was my original placement, and what I have now is like a very tiny rectangle. Now I just pressed it quickly to flatten it out, and you can see because I clipped into the corners, it made it very easy for me to turn it through. It hasn't caused a problem at all. Now, from the right side, I'm going to use my presser foot as a guide, and I'm going to sew around so I'm about 1/4 of an inch away. So what I'm doing now is I'm making a decorative box that's about between 1/4 and 3/8 of an inch all the way around the slot opening. And this is what really makes it look professional, the fact that you're taking the time. Now I'm top stitching this with white thread. Now you would be doing it in a thread that matched your fabric. But this is a wonderful kind of opening for either a hand woven or a quilted fabric because it works well on heavy things. Now, can you see from the front here how I have a nice little rectangle stitched on there? Now what I'll do is on the back now, I'm going to turn it over, and now I can take and I can trim this excess. Now these are little pelican scissors. These are really nice when you want to trim close. I'm going to trim off the excess ultra leather beyond where, this is a wonderful way to use up your scraps of these little fake suedes and leathers. See, I'm trimming it right very close to the stitching line. So when I turn it over to the wrong side, this is what you see. You just see the little leather rectangle, and from the right side, you see a top-stitched little box that looks real nice. I think choice of buttons is so important with beautiful fabrics like quilted fabrics and hand-woven fabrics. If you will look at these buttons, you can see that they kind of have, I'd say, an earthy feel to them, but they blend in. I mean, they're beautiful, but they don't stand out like a sore thumb, like a plastic button would. So this is a couple of these are little fossil buttons. I get a lot of buttons from Paco he's a button maker in Cave Junction, and also Worldly Goods and Antique Buttons. And any place, a lot of the fabric stores have good buttons now. They're really getting into it. So you want one that blends in and doesn't stick out too much because it takes away from the fabric. Here's an example of one of Paco's buttons. That's a turquoise button with a sterling silver bevel, and that works really well on this piece of blue hand woven. This is an example of the beautiful shirt that Linda made, and if you don't have access to great buttons, sometimes all she did was she used the back side of a button. And sometimes if you just turn the button over, this button looked like a white plastic button from the front, but on the back side it looked better. And I've done that with a lot of abalone buttons. See, here's the back side of the button. So don't always think you have to use the front side. These buttons were antique buttons, but they had that same kind of color in it that were really nice. And I used a loop instead of a buttonhole in the case of something like this. So they're real subtle on here, but they go well with the fabric. Now, in order to put grommets on this hand woven, I'd have to do something to stabilize the area, or this grommet would just work its way out within the first wearing. So what I did on this coat was these are little ultra suede circles, and I just thought I'd show you how I did it. I took a circle of fusible web interfacing and I pressed that on first, and then I took some fabric glue and I glued that on next, and then after those dried, then I made the grommet through there. And I've had this coat for 8 years and I haven't had any of them work loose. A sleeve can be a really special way to show off your sewing talents. I mean, facing a sleeve. This is an example. I call it a sleeve facing. On this white coat, what I've taken is I have faced it with quilted fabric. So it's the same color, but it's just a little different. On Linda's coat, she took and faced it with the rayon fabric that matched up with the under collar. Now, in both cases, this becomes a little eye-catching detail. So I thought I'd show you how to do this. Now, if the sleeve is plain, we don't have to do anything. But in this case, the sleeve has little pleats in it. So we start out by pleating those pleats out because we don't want to have pleats in on the cuff. So we'll pleat these pleats out. And now we'll have the pattern for the cuff. Now we want to eliminate extra seams, so we'll take and we'll only have one seam, and that's at the underarm. So if the sleeve is in two pieces like this, we want to overlap one of the seams, seam allowance there, so that our pattern for our sleeve cuff will only be the bottom half, and it will only have one seam. So here's an example of one that I cut. Now this is, I've cut it out of the contrasting fabric. See, it'll only have one seam now, and I fused interfacing on the back of it. So I've interfaced my cuff, and you do not have to use the same fabric. In fact, a lot of times it's more effective to use a lighter weight fabric. Now, we will take this now and sew the seam together for the cuff, like this. I'll just pin it to save some time. But now, how wide is this? I usually like to cut it 6 inches wide. And let's pretend we sew this by machine. Now, we take this and we slip it onto the sleeve. And you're not going to have any problem doing this because it matches perfectly, see? So then you sew this in a circle around the bottom edge. Now, you sew this in a circle, remember matching up the seam with the seam at the sleeve. Now I've sewn it around the bottom, and now I can turn the cuff to the inside. Now see, this is going to be the inside of the sleeve now. And when I do this now, you can see later on, this can be turned up like this. But now let's turn it, this is the outside, let's turn it so it's the wrong side out, so you can see what we're talking about here. Because what we have now is we have the facing. Now what are we going to do with this? If this is an unlined jacket, I can merely either turn the edge under if it's not heavy, or I can put a Hong Kong finish on there with a little piece of lining some way, and then I would just hand stitch it. But if I'm planning to line the coat, what I want to do is I want to take the lining, and how long do I cut the lining? The biggest mistake I've ever done is I always end up cutting the lining too short. Do you see how if I put this on here, I would have just barely enough to attach it? I find I cut the lining the same length as the sleeve, and then what I usually will do is take and cut it off halfway up the cuff. And then, even though I've got it halfway up the cuff, then I push the lining up and I attach it at the very top of the cuff. And then do you see what I end up having is a little bit of extra lining in there, and that keeps the sleeve from drawing up. One thing I never like to see at the bottom of the sleeve is kind of elastic and gathers. I think it's a real unprofessional way, so I'm going to show you a real easy way to take out the fullness on a sleeve. And it takes 2 minutes and it looks real professional. You go ahead and hem the seam, hem the garment as you would ordinarily, and you say, oh, this is just too big. So then all I did here was I took a pleat in the sleeve at the bottom, and then I held it in place by merely sewing a button on there. So I mean, what it is it shows a nice little pleat at the bottom, and it has a little button to hold it into place. So you've made the sleeve smaller, It looks real nice. It looks very nice on the outside. It's just a lot more professional looking than gathers or elastic. So either you use the cuff method or you use this little pleat method, but one of those will look very nice. Now, the pocket I'm about to show you may be the easiest pocket you've ever seen. And whenever you see it on something, it looks like it's really difficult, but it's not. It looks great. There are two versions. This is the pocket that Linda did on hers, and it's the same method I'm going to show you, but she just put something interesting behind it with a little brocade from a kimono. Or on the case of this long garment, this long coat, unlined, and I backed it with a piece of suede. So it's the same technique whether you sew a square, whether you sew a circle or a heart. You can use anything you want. So I'm going to show you how to do this now. Now, one of the things you have to realize is that it's very hard to get your hand inside of a pocket that's less than 6 inches long. So we're going to make it's 6 inches long, and you can decide however much you want the opening to be. This is 2.5 inches. Remember how Linda did the circle? Any of these shapes are just fine. And I put a piece of fusible interfacing behind this because the interfacing has to be, if you don't put any interfacing behind, your pocket will be too weak. So I cut if this is 2.5 inches wide, I cut the interfacing about 4 inches by 8 inches. So I have a little bit of extra interfacing. So I've drawn my shape that I want it to be on the back. This is the back side of the garment. Now, in this case, I want to put a piece of suede, and so I've cut this piece 8 inches wide by 18 inches long. Since I didn't have a long enough piece of the suede, this is real suede, I just pieced it at the bottom. So now I'll turn it over, and I'll put right sides together. Now this is a case where I'm just estimating where to pin it because I'm really going to be doing my sewing from the other side. So I can pin it on the back side. I usually just pin it at the top and at the bottom of where I want it to be. Don't have to worry about it too much here. Now, I turn it over, and I'm going to sew this rectangle now. Now, what do I know about sewing rectangles? Since this is a hand woven, I'm going to make my stitch a little bit smaller so that any stress or anything, none of my threads will pull out. Whenever I come to the corners, I want to hand walk the corner so I can clip in there really close. So here we go, just sewing around. I come down one side, I come to the corner, and I always hand walk on the corner just because I can't seem to regulate the foot pedal to only go 2 stitches. Now, I will cut the opening like this, cut through. Okay, and then I usually go and get into the corner as soon as possible. And I want to take real care not to snip through the corner. See, I'm close. How close am I? I'm like 1 stitch away. I'm really close in there, do you see? If I don't go close, I'm not going to be able to turn it. So now I'll continue on into the other corner. And now I'll turn it through. Now I'm going to turn it, unpin it. I'm going to turn it through the other side like this. And then what am I going to do? I'm going to come over and I'm going to press it into position. So what I'll do is I'll just turn it through and then I'm going to press it into position and I'll bring it back. Now I've pressed my little window, and now I'm going to take my suede and let the top part drop down and make a window shade. So what you have to make sure of is when you lay this on here like this, that, you know, before we sewed it, that the longer part is on the top of the garment because it will drop down as we're showing like this. All right? So now it's dropped down into position. So now what do we want to do? We want to really just finish this pocket up, and all we do is we fold it in. See, we're going to bring it up. We're going to sew the pocket on the ends like this. We'll take it over the machine. But see, I'll just lift up so that all I'm doing now is sewing down the triangles. All right, right here. And it's easy to do because I have my original stitching to follow. All right, there's one side. And here's my other side. You know what it reminds me of is a big buttonhole when I do this. It's just like a big giant opening. Or it can also remind you of that little thing I did with the button, only the button opening, only I didn't stitch down the triangles. I just top stitched it all the way around. Now, all right, now there's something else I have to do. I would have to add another piece of fabric on here because now, and usually that would be a piece of lighter weight fabric. Now this piece fills in, this is the back of the pocket, and then we lift it up and we can see we're going to need a little extra length down here so we can actually have this as an acting pocket. So you can take a small piece, this is just a piece of linen, and I will connect it up right sides together so that now I have enough pocket at the bottom. Now, you know, one of the things you always have to remember when you're sewing with either these leather or suedes is you need the even feed foot on or the dual feed, or else a Teflon foot, otherwise it sticks. Now do you see I have enough length? Now actually I have too much, I don't need that much, but this way you can get the idea of what we're doing here. Okay, let's look at it from the front side because it can get confusing very easily here. Now, this is the top part of the pocket, this is the back part. So now we don't need all of this extra pocketing fabric, so we'll just cut it off so it matches in length to the bottom part of the suede. Now all we need to do now is we're going to close up the pocket. So we just take another, we can come right around, easily pin it before I sit down to sew it. I will go right around to the bottom. You know when we sew down the extra triangles? Well, I clipped them off so there'll be just one line. So we'll just go around the bottom and back up the other side. So that's what we'll do now. We sew over the triangles again. And now we're closing up the bottom part of the pocket so that we can actually use the pocket. Now, you know, when I come to the bottom of the pocket, I never sew real corners. I always go around on an oval, just because corners on a pocket are really kind of lint catchers. So do you see how I'm just going around like this instead of doing real corners on the pocket? So now I'll lift up and I sew close in there to right on top of attaching those triangles down again. Now you'll see that the pocket is finished. So this, see, the pocket is closed at the bottom. Now your garment would hang down here. Here's how it looks on the back side. Now, let's talk about this. Would we want the underside of the garment? See, usually it would be lined, so we wouldn't have this. Let's talk about, like I did on the black coat, I didn't have any of this showing, because let's take a look at it. And what we do, if this were on an unlined garment, we'd have to make sure that our fusible interfacing matched pretty well to the fabric it was on, and that our pocketing fabric also matched. Now what I did on the black coat, let's just look at the back. I did the whole pocket with the suede. Okay, I didn't put any pocketing fabric. I used it for the whole thing. And then on the outside of the garment, just to keep it in place so it didn't flip-flop all around, I then come and top stitched all the way down on the outside. So you don't see it because it gets lost here on the hand woven, but it's actually the shape of the pocket is stitched in a rectangle on the outside so that this thing doesn't move around and show the messy part of the under pocket. So that would be the last stage on this. I could leave it just like that, but it looks nicer if I just sew down and sew the rectangle. It's just a wonderful pocket, and remember, this doesn't have to be a rectangle. It could be an oval, it could be a circle, and you can do anything behind here. Here's something, this is an obi, these are Japanese obis, and these make a nice thing to put behind there. Not particularly one with this one, but always look around for little extra bits of fabric because that can go behind the pocket if you don't want to do suede, because that's the kind of thing that really makes it interesting, and it's just you to see a little bit, and these are real details. So this is a very easy pocket that anybody can do. This is an example of a hand-woven bodice that's just like a little short overtop with suede trim. Now you can use suede, you can use leather, ultra suede. Let's see how you go about using it. Now this particular piece is ultra leather. Ultra leather is kind of neat because it has stretch in all directions. So that means you wouldn't have to buy very much. You'd have to buy maybe 1/4 of a yard and you'd have lots of trim. But if you use ultra suede, see, ultra suede doesn't have quite as much stretch, so you might want to cut that a little bit off grain. And then there's real suede, and that always has a little bit of give to it. So now what we want to do, this would be a trim that you'd use on something that's unlined. We're going to cut the strips 2.5 inches wide. And I've got a curved edge here because I want to show you how to handle curves. So we'll put this trim now right sides together, and if we want to have, we would have already cut off our seam allowance, because what this is going to end up being is, this will be the finished edge. So if you've got a seam allowance on there, you want to cut it off so that the edge is actually the finished edge, the finished width of the front. So now we've got it pinned on right sides together. Now we have a straight stitch, but we have a little bit longer stitch than normally. Why don't we have a small zigzag on here? Because we don't want this to stretch in any way. So now I have right sides together. Now I'm just going along here with dual feed or with an even feed foot or Teflon foot, and I'm just sewing at 5/8. Now it's very easy. It's going along very well. I'm making sure that it's not stretching. Now it's going to get a little more complicated as I go around the curve at the bottom of the garment. And I chose this so you could see how to handle it. Now, if I just go ahead and go around the curve, it will stretch and it'll cup under. So what you have to remember about trim is that it's on the outside edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed in a little more trim. Do you see how I'm pushing with my fingers? So there's a little more trim per garment. So because this has got to wrap around, so it has to be a little bit bigger of whatever it's attached to. Now this is a place also where I pieced the leather strip together, and there's no special treatment to piecing it, just piece it. Straight seam. So now, you see how I pushed in a little bit of extra leather at this point because I want to wrap it around and I don't want it to actually curl. Now, the next thing I do is take this ultra leather and I wrap it around to the back. Now I don't turn anything under here. This is real important. I just flatten it out, wrap it around, and then I pin it in the well of the seam. So now you can actually, sometimes I've even gotten away without pinning this, but if you spend all this time, it doesn't take very long just to pin it as you go around. Now what I'm doing now is I'm sewing right next to the well of the seam. If you're good at sewing in the well, go ahead and sew in the well. But now my leather's not turned under, it's just merely enclosing the raw edge of the seam. Now this is the full 5/8 seam. So after we do this, you can decide which one you like. So we're going down, and it doesn't take very long to do it. And the real secret to nothing stretching here is the fact that you're using dual feed or the even feed foot. Now we have it trimmed a little closer here, so we'll see. Now this is the one where I trim the seam allowance down on the lower part, so I just want to do both so you can see. Now this is 1/4 of an inch, so you can decide how you feel about that. I've done both on garments. I've done 1/4 of an inch and I've done the full 5/8. It just depends on how visible you want it to be. Now this is the finish that I used on the black hand-woven coat with the black suede trim. So we're just going around the curve, and we're not having any problems with it. It's such an easy finish, and it's really nice. I always feel that leather and suede, it increases the perceived value. And if you're thinking about doing something like this, selling hand-woven things, I think that you can increase the price when you do something like this. Now, here's the final result here. This is the thin one. Now remember, you wouldn't be seeing this stitching here. I did it in the thread so you can see. Do you see it here? This is the thin one, and this is the thick one. So you can decide which one you like. Now, after you do this, then you turn it to the back, and what you want to do is you want to trim off the extra. Now this is when I really love to use these little pelican scissors, because they enable you to slide in there and get real close to your stitching. So remember, you haven't turned anything under. Now here we are down with the wide one. So let's trim that one down and see how that looks. So on the back side, all you're going to see is this. Now, let's look at, so this is the back side. It's either like this, or if you've used the wide trim, it's like this. Now you can see by me feeding this in the way I did and using a little extra trim, you can see that this is not cupping in any way. Now this is where I seamed, I had to seam my leather strip because I didn't have as much. One of the things you want to do is always make the placement of this, decide on the placement. I remember the first thing I ever trimmed with leather, I actually did the joining so it was right here in the front. And so you can place this anywhere and try to get it a little over on the side. You know, if this is the length of the front, don't have your piecing here. Slip your strip around like this is down here at the bottom so you can't see it. Then the last thing we'll do is we'll go over to the iron now and we'll press this and hit it with a clapper so it looks nice and flat. Now if I went to press this right here without a press cloth, this ultra leather would stick all over the bottom of the iron because it is a synthetic and it is a plastic essentially. So, but I can press it if I put a press cloth over it, and once again I'll spray it. I cannot stress the importance of pressing it and pounding it. It makes all the difference in the world. So I have my clapper nearby, so I give it lots of steam, and you don't have to beat it to death. You just hold it flat. And you know, if you really want a nice finish on something, if you want a nice crisp finish, especially if you're working with wool, if you don't pick it up until it dries completely, it doesn't take that long. But can you see now on that curved edge, I'm not having any cupping in because I allowed enough. Remember, I pushed a little extra trim, and that's where I seamed it. So you might want to position that seam so it's not showing so much. You won't have the thread showing because you'd be using thread that matched. I think that leather and suede trim, whether it's real or synthetic, is really a very nice way to finish a garment. It eliminates bulk and it just looks real nice. Now this is the jacket pattern itself. Usually when I cut a lining, I don't use the lining pattern given by the pattern because I find sometimes it's too skimpy. I use the pattern itself. And this is the full length of the jacket. Now this jacket allows for a 2-inch hem. If you were working with typical fabric that didn't have any give to it, what you would do is you would take and you would fold up the hem allowance and you would cut the lining to the finished length of the garment. So that would be where the hem crease should be. And that's what you could do with a quilted fabric. But in the case of a hand-woven fabric, where the fabric has a tendency to relax, you either want to only fold up half the hem allowance, or if it's really a saggy, baggy kind of fabric, hand-woven, allow the entire amount. So you'd cut the lining even, you won't fold up a hem in the lining, you'll just cut it the full length so that we have room to work with. Because then we'll put the lining in the garment, and we'll leave it free on the bottom edge. So I'll show you that now on the dress form. Now what I've done is I've attached the lining to the jacket, you know, where the facing ends. So I went all the way around the neck and I ended down at the bottom. But what I did is I didn't finish it off at the bottom. I just let it hang free. And I've got it so that the lining, remember how I cut the lining? Instead of to the finished length of the jacket, I just cut it the full length. Because in the case of this jacket, what I did is I fused the back of the entire front, but the back of it I didn't fuse because I wanted it to drape because it had a big pleat. So you can see here, what I want to do is I want to take now at the bottom edge of the jacket, see I've already hemmed the jacket now, the jacket is already hemmed, the lining is not attached. I want to take and with a felt tip pen, fabric pen preferably, but I'm using felt tip so you can see, I'm tracing where the hem crease on the jacket is on the lining. So now I'll turn it around. Now it'll be interesting to see, do you see the fusing ended at the side seam? Now you see how the hand woven has started to relax and it's using up more of the lining, and that's why on a lot of hand woven garments you see where the jacket is kind of bulging, because what's happening is the lining won't allow it to relax. Now look here at the center back, how it's used everything but a 1/4 of an inch, and it had a whole 2 inches attached here. Do you see how? Now I'm getting back up where the fabric is more stable because it was fused. So I mark on the fold like this. Now if you use this technique, you will always have a lining that relaxes and doesn't impose on the garment. Now what we're going to do now is cut off the excess. Now do you remember how the felt tip pen, how in the front area it hung longer? So now I'll just cut that. So now this length will be the same all the way around. So I'll cut the excess here. And you'll see now I'm just going to blend this in to the back where it started to need all of it. You see how it needed all of it there? And now, if you've got an area like this, do you see how this all seems to be doing fine and then this hikes way up here? Now, I'd be suspicious of that. So what I'll do is I'll kind of go in between. I could either put it on the mannequin again and see if I misjudged, but I find if when I pin one hikes way up like that, I probably made the mistake, not the fabric. So I'll just cut the excess off like this. All right, now what am I going to do now? Now we're going to start at the center back now, and we're going to fold under just a 1/2 inch on the lining, and we're going to put it onto the bottom where the hem is. Now, it's very important. This coat has already been hemmed. A lining never holds up the hem. I can't get over, I see garments like that where you think that the lining is holding up the hem. The garment is hemmed already, and I've hit the bottom edge, the crease, with a clapper so it's nice and flat. Now I'll fold up a 1/2 inch on the lining, and I'm going to attach the lining right at the top of the hem. Just a little bit down so the overlock doesn't show. And a lining is a wonderful technique to do with a hand woven because it keeps the wear and tear from the inside of the garment. Now we're coming over here to the side where you've got to see what to do at the edge of the facing. Do you see how this comes down here? This is where it forms what's called a take-up tuck. So what you want to do is you want to still get that, move that up like this, and you just kind of fold it in a little more there. So, and see, I need to fold in a little bit more. So that, see, when this garment, after I do the hemming, this lining is actually going to relax, and it's going to have a little pleat that hangs down like this. See, the lining right now is a little bit bigger, and that's what we want it to be, but when I finished hemming it, it'll hang down like this, and it'll cover the hand stitching. So you never want to hem it so it's so short so it pulls. And see, that's why I cut the lining to the edge of the hem, but then I'm attaching it at the top, so I have a little give. Now, for the hand stitching, all that I do is I usually start here on the end, and I'll simply hide my knot underneath there. And all I do is attach, I slide it along the underneath between, so that I don't just catch it like this. I slide it along between and then take one stitch. Slide it along the fold and take another stitch. Now, about every fourth stitch, what I do is I take and knot it. Just so if this ever gets caught on something, the entire hem doesn't come out of the lining. So I slide it along and attach it. So that's how you attach the lining at the bottom. So it's not really a big problem in any way, but I just want to do a little bit of it so you can see how. Now, after I finish this, I go over to the iron and see, then I'll press it and it'll just relax. In fact, I can reach the iron here and you'll see. This is how it will look eventually. And then it always has this little bit of play, and that's what enables it to hang well on the inside. Linings really do a beautiful job on the inside, and you know, if you've got such beautiful fabric on the inside, why not line it and really give it the Rolls Royce? I like for linings Ambiance. It's a Bemberg rayon product. It's a wonderful product. If you can't find a good selection of colors, G Street Fabrics in Rockville, Maryland will mail order lots of colors. That is also washable, so if you want to hand wash something, the lining can do the same. The other thing is China silk. That works real well. Or also silk crepe de chine. What I don't like is acetate, and I don't like polyester because they don't breathe very well. Now, weighting a jacket hem is not mandatory, but it's a wonderful way to make the garment hang closer to the body. And if you'll look at this jacket, I've taken a weighted chain and I have run it along at the bottom where the hem of the lining joins the hem of the jacket. I've taken some weight and I've hand attached it on. Now, there are lots of different kinds of weight, but choose one with some body to it. Now, unfortunately, this one's more expensive than both, but the idea is not decorative. It's to really give it some weight so it does hang closer to the body. Okay. Now, if you wanted to attach it to this coat, do you see I'd start it right there along the edge, and I'd have a knot. I usually use double thread to do this, just because the chain is weighty. So I'll start it right there, right where the hem joins. Now, you will not be using white thread. I'm only doing this so you'd see it. You'd use a thread that matches. And do a couple of stitches right there on the end. Now, once you get it attached there, slide the thread along between the layers and go along, I can see, about 4 links, and then take a knot. Okay, so and I like to make a little knot between each one in case it ever catches and then the whole chain doesn't fall off. So you see now I'm going to slide the needle between a little distance. Now, where's my needle going? It's going between my hem and between the outside of the garment. You might want to check that to make sure you're not doing it so it comes to the outside. Now, I've gone 4 lengths. I attach it 1, 2, and then I usually make a little knot in the thread. Now, you'll need some wire cutters just so you can cut the end of the chain, and that's the end of weighting a jacket. But if you've never had one, it really makes a difference, and it's especially nice with a handwoven or quilted fabric because it brings it in close to the body and it allows it to hang beautifully. Now, if you want to make a real Chanel type jacket, what you want is you want the lining to come all the way over. You eliminate a facing, and the lining comes all the way to the edge, like I've done on this jacket. And this is a technique that I learned from the sewing workshop from Barbara Kelly, and it's a wonderful thing. She brings the lining all the way over to the edge here. Now, what do you do? Let me just show you how we do that. Because when the lining comes over to the edge, you've got a little problem with the lining sneaking out. It keeps wanting to peek out. So what I've done is I've just hand basted all the way around, and then you go over to the iron and hit it with a clapper, and you get a nice sharp crease there. Now, if you're not going to put any trim on, then you have to do something here so that this edge stays back. Otherwise, it's going to keep coming forward. So if you're not going to put any trim, or I just do this whether I'm putting trim or not, it's just a way to keep my lining in the back. I'm going to take and start my thread, and what I want to do is I want to slide my needle in between about every ½ inch, and then I come through the top and have a stitch on the back. And then I come out again. And see, what I'm doing is I'm giving this a memory. So no matter how much it wants to sneak out here, it can't do it. See, and then on the top, I take a stitch, and the hand stitches are actually sink into either the felted or the hand-woven fabric. So it makes it very easy. So then you come out. Let's show you on the back. I'll show you about the trim in just a second. But what you see in this case, so you just slide it between every ½ inch. You don't see anything from the top side, but on the underneath side, you can see a little hand stitch every ½ inch. That's fine. Don't worry about that. That's a sign of a quality garment. Now, if you decide you want to jazz it up and really add some nice trim, one of the things that's very important is to choose a trim that is flexible. Do you see how this one's very flexible? If you choose a stiff trim, you're going to have difficulty getting it to go around the edge at the top or at the curves at the bottom. And you just overlap it here. When you miter something, you hand miter in the case of trim. You never trim off the stuff underneath, or it will tend to unravel because this is rayon. Now, this trim merely floats on the top. You put it on by hand. You never stitch it on by machine, and all you need to do to attach it by hand is, once again, take a thread that matches, not the way I'm showing you to do here. But we're going to lay the trim on the top, and we'll just take one stitch over the trim. Do you see how it holds it down there? And then we'll slide it along. One stitch over the trim, slide it another ½ inch. The important thing when you apply trim, and I did this to both sides on the brown jacket. See, I did it to this side, and then I did it to the other side. The most important thing when applying trim is to not pull your thread too tight, because if you pull your thread too tight, it'll cause it to bunch up. If you can remember this, I can kind of slip my fingernails under this, meaning it merely floats on the surface. Now, I hope I have piqued your excitement about cutting into these wonderful fabrics. I mean, they are just like fabric. When you cut into the hand woven, it doesn't start disintegrating all over the place. All you have to do is you have to decide, are you going to fuse it? If so, you fuse to the back of it, or you just overlock it. But some way, stabilize the edges. But remember, it's just fabric. And you know, if I've gotten you a little excited about sewing, I've produced 3 books and many videos. I've produced a book for the beginner called Fear of Sewing, Power Sewing for the intermediate, and More Power Sewing for the real connoisseur. But But I think if you cut into this wonderful fabric, you will find that this will probably be the most beautiful garment you've ever made.
Look for these products produced by Power Sewing. Power Sewing, new ways to make fine clothes fast. More Power Sewing, master's techniques for the sewing connoisseur. Fear of Sewing for the novice. Fear of Sewing video, how to thread and operate a sewing machine, plus skirt and trouser hems, sewing on a button, and much more. Pattern sizing and alteration video. End the fitting frustrations by getting the facts on which patterns run large, small, and true to size, plus an easy method to determine pattern alterations. Fitting solutions video. See 16 women representing a wide array of fitting challenges. See pattern alterations and final garments. Foolproof pants fitting video. Secrets of European fit are revealed with this foolproof method for perfect fit, eliminating guesswork, altering the pattern before you cut. Construction difficulties video. Perfect to overcome obstacles found in garment construction, fly fronts, difficult seams, sleeve vents, lapels, shoulder pads, and grain line changes to flatter the figure. Easy linings video. Learn lining shortcuts used in the industry which cut lining time by 2/3. Jacket, vests, and pants are covered. Hassle-free designer jackets video. Learn interfacing choices for a wide variety of fabrics, as well as world-class welt pockets and handling difficult fabrics at the machine and press. Embellishment video. Learn embellishment techniques for multiple piping, braid application, layer trim, plus hand and machine beading. Commercial pattern refinements video. Refine the pattern to eliminate shoulders which ride to the back, sleeves which wrinkle, armhole stabilization for silk, and tips for good-looking buttonholes. Fearless serging video. Learn to use your serger to its full potential, adjusting tension knobs and varying thread type to achieve a variety of decorative effects. Marketing what you make video. If you dream of becoming a designer, selling art to wear, or a dressmaker, this video is for you. Interviews with designers, a sales rep, and dressmakers give you the nitty-gritty on determining your market, pricing, making first sales, sewing contractors, and factoring for finance. Handwoven and Quilted Garments video. By their very nature, these fabrics present certain difficulties. Learn appropriate interfacing, seam treatment, neckline and facing finishes, professional hems, lining techniques, and classy closures.